And oh, for those of you who might just be tuning in, this is Live with Josie. I go live every week at Wednesdays at 5 p.m. PST and talk about something related to inclusive and high performing teams in tech. And today I'm talking about inclusive meetings. And I am an executive coach for engineering leaders focused on building inclusive and high performing teams through empathetic management practices and inclusive culture building. And I'm also a technical startup advisor at what I call the intersection of inclusion and technology. And so I think one of the most important practices of inclusive leadership starts with inclusive meetings. We're in meetings a large portion of our day, especially as leaders. And so this is a practice that can really help us. But before I dive into inclusive meetings, I want to top on one of the topics I usually start with, which is the inclusive news headlines. And so recently, the ACT report, which talked about DEI in tech, was released from the DEI Innovation Summit. And it was a really insightful report on how things are in the industry. And part of their summary said that while there's greater awareness around diversity and inclusion, the biggest challenge is a great uncertainty around where to actually take action to make real progress. And, this honestly really aligns with my mission and why I'm an executive coach for engineering leaders, because I truly believe that if we build more inclusive leadership within engineering, we'll not only get more inclusive and diverse teams, but we'll also build better products that truly fulfill the needs of our diverse world. So the ACT report said there's 4 areas that we should really focus on. The first one is to model and incentivize inclusive leadership. So things like what I'm talking about today and leading with inclusive meetings. The second is really operationalizing DEI throughout the business. And this comes into everything from inclusive hiring, having core values that are tied to inclusive behaviors, such as starting with trust and building psychological safety, and many more. The third item is sharing DEI data, metrics, and goals. So this is really about collaborating, not just within your company, but also with your peers outside and taking the time to figure out what is working. We don't have to keep doing these items in isolation. And finally, number 4 is focusing on transforming pathways into tech for underrepresented groups, because there's really 2 challenges going on here. First, it's retaining this talent, which is a lot about what I talk about, right? We've got so many folks leaving the tech industry due to unfairness. But yet also we have challenges with getting people into tech in the first place. And so I think that last one is very crucial. So that's what the inclusion news headlines for the week. For those of you who may just be tuning in, I'm Josie Haynes, and this is my weekly live, Live with Josie, where I talk about different topics around building inclusive and high-performing teams in tech. And so next, I wanted to talk about my win for the last week, which was I actually got an award for I was in Mogul's top 100 DEI leaders. So that was very exciting to hear about. And so next, I really wanted to talk about the topic for the week, which is inclusive meetings. So I think this is one of the, like I said earlier, we are in meetings all the time, and yet so many folks are saying, they feel their time is wasted. And inclusive meetings are also effective meetings. And so let's dive in. First is, do you even need to have this meeting? Are you just communicating status that you could really communicate more effectively asynchronously? Or does this need to be a discussion and decision? And do you need to have that be one meeting or multiple meetings? So first, really planning. And if it is that second one, where you really truly do need people in person or virtually in a meeting, first, it's crucial to create an agenda. And, the agenda really needs to contain multiple things. First, is what is the goal for this meeting, right? If it's to get to a decision, what's being accomplished in the first meeting, if there's going to be multiple meetings in this series, if this is a recurring meeting, what are the expectations and goals for the participants showing up? Next is really to cover what are the questions that are going to be discussed in the meeting, so people can have time to brainstorm ahead of time, especially if there isn't potentially going to be time for that in the meeting, which though I highly recommend to have separate brainstorming time in the meeting. And next is for each agenda item, put some approximate timing next to it so that you can assign a facilitator to help keep track of time and make sure the meeting is moving forward. And finally, be sure to cover any action items if this was a recurring meeting that were from the previous meeting and any status updates from them so that only any questions about those need to be discussed within the meeting. So now that you've got your agenda, if there's also, make sure to add in there any homework. If there's some pre-reading you want folks to do or anything else, be sure that that's included in the meeting. And if there is homework, don't send it out the night before at 10 p.m. for people to read for a 9 a.m. meeting the next morning. That is not inclusive. Give people at least 24 hours so they can prepare for the meeting. And next is when to have your meeting. It's important to consider, especially in our virtual environment, the time zones of all of your participants and the attendees during the meeting. And that's important. And so, take the time to make sure that the meeting time works for all the participants, or if it isn't at a particularly convenient time, that then you alternate it potentially on different weeks to ensure that, it's not always at 7 a.m. for one group of folks. Next, look at the invitee list. Under the guise of inclusion, sometimes you try to invite everybody, but then after you get a meeting to a certain number of people, you're not going to be productive in having a discussion. So does everybody in that invitee list need to actually be there? But you also need to ask yourself the opposite question. Who else should be there that maybe hasn't been considered? Who may have a disagreeing viewpoint that you should actually include in that meeting? Next is setting up some ground rules for inclusive meetings. Inclusive meetings does not mean you're not going to potentially have disagreements, but it's about having ground rules about how to have those disagreements in effective ways. So no interrupting, no talking over each other, no multitasking, no having judgments during brainstorming, and I'll talk about that more a little bit later, and really having somebody to help with timekeeping notes and action and tracking action items. And so that's the next item, right? Is first, the facilitator is really the person who's going to help with time checking and making sure that you've got an agenda. They're also going to be paying attention to ensuring the fact that everybody in the room's opinions have been heard and ensuring that credit is fairly given, even though both of those should really be done by everybody, but especially the facilitator is going to pay attention to those. And the facilitator is also going to make sure that folks aren't interrupting each other. And then next, there should be a note taker. But one of the things I want to make sure we talk about here is women shouldn't just volunteer to be note takers, because unfortunately we tend to do more of those glue type roles and then not get credit for it. So the facilitator, the note taker, any other roles that you have during the meeting should be rotated fairly. Next is, if you're going to be making a decision, there should be clear brainstorming time and there should be clear decision-making time. During brainstorming, there should first be at least a few minutes where people can ideate for themselves on what their opinions are. And then we should go around the room and have everybody share their opinion. And there should be no judgment during the opinion sharing phase. And this is where you can really effectively leverage the yes and technique when sharing ideas, which is, no buts, no buts allowed at this point. Who's taking notes? Brainstorming time versus decision time. Yes. So in brainstorming time, there should be really no judgment in inclusive meetings. And so I was just talking about the fact that it is crucial to have brainstorming time and decision time and have those be separate. And when you're having brainstorming time, there should really be no judgment. You want to have quiet time for brainstorming. And so people can think, right? And then go around the room. Have everyone share their ideas and no judgment. It's crucial because that's what builds the psychological safety. The second there's a little bit of judgment, then somebody's going to be like, ooh, maybe I don't want to share that idea, right? And so here's where you can really leverage a technique called yes and. Yes and is a great technique for sharing ideas because you make an assumption that even if you disagree, somebody else's idea is at least 10% right. So you take that part and then you say, yes, I agree with this part. And here's what I want to add to it. And that is truly how we make a really leverage the power of diversity to build even better products, right? And then once you've done the brainstorming, there should be a decision time. And it's really important that it's clear ahead of time how this decision is going to be made. Who owns the decision? This is where things like RACI and DACI metrics can be super helpful. And so be sure to have a clear communication about who ultimately is the decision maker, when is the decision being made? Is it in this meeting? Is it going to be afterwards? And, and if it's going to be afterwards, be sure to clearly share that with everybody in the room afterwards. And that leads finally to after the meeting, which is first, you want to send a summary of your notes out to everybody. So whoever was the note taker should send out the summary of notes and the action items and make sure that there's assigned to appropriate people. And then finally, checking in with the attendees on the meeting. So and how it went. If there's any feedback on how it went, this is where a meeting pulse survey on Slack might be a little thing you can build and through the integrations and quickly share that out to get people just to give you a thumbs up or a rating on your meetings. You don't have to do that every time, but there's so many articles on how ineffective our meetings are. So that's why I think it's so important that we talk about building inclusive and effective meetings in tech. And so that wraps up another episode of Live with Jossie. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I'm going to actually check to make sure that the video actually started from the beginning. And if it didn't, I will be sure to share the full video out on YouTube in the next couple of days. And thank you so much for tuning in. And it was great talking about building inclusive and effective meetings. And so thank you for joining. This was another episode of Live with Josie, Wednesdays at 5 p.m. PST. I'm an executive coach and technical advisor at the intersection of inclusion and technology. If you want to learn more or you have a need for a public speaker related on this topic at your company, be sure to DM me. All right. Thank you for tuning in. Bye.